today we're going to be looking at weather hazards as our main topic. A reminder that all these topics are covered across the different boards in slightly different ways and answers. So what are weather hazards? Let's get into this topic. Remember to have your piece of paper, you're making some notes as you're going along. I've bullet pointed the key points on the right hand side of the presentation for you, should you want to make some brief notes. And of course, if you have any questions, just pop them into the chat. So let's kick off with looking at what is global atmospheric circulation. So the Earth's atmosphere is a bit like a giant ocean of air, essentially, that surrounds our planet. And this air moves around in a big circular pattern, which is called the global atmospheric circulation. The main force that drives this circulation is the heat from the sun. So when the sun's rays hit the Earth, they warm the surface of the planet, but the Earth's surface isn't heated evenly across. Some parts of the planet, like the equator, get a lot more direct sunlight and therefore become a lot hotter than other places, such as the poles. So the difference in the temperature causes a difference in air pressure between the equator and the poles. So air naturally flows from areas of high pressure to areas of low pressure. So the air from the equator moves towards the poles, creating what we know as Hadley cells, Hadley cells. So as the warm air moves up towards the pole, it begins to rise up and begins to cool down. And so the cool air is much denser than the warmer air, so it begins to sink back down towards the Earth's surface. And this sinking air creates a high pressure zone at around 30 degrees north and south of the equator. This is known as the subtropical high. So the cool dense air then moves back towards the equator, completing the circulation pattern. Now, as it does that, it also picks up moisture from the ocean, and it creates a belt of tropical rainforests near the equator called the intertropical convergence zone. So there are lots of other factors that affect the global atmospheric circulation, such as the Earth's rotation and the distribution of land and water on the planet. But the main driver is the unequal heating of the Earth's surface by the sun. Let's move on to the next bit, unless you have any questions. So how are tropical storms formed? A hurricane is a type of a tropical cyclone, which is a big storm that forms over a warm ocean water. They're also called cyclones and typhoons. The warm water needs to be around 26.5 degrees Celsius or warmer to provide the necessary heat and moisture to create the storm. And hurricanes are very powerful storms with very strong winds, heavy rain, and dangerous storm surges. So the first thing that needs to happen for a hurricane to form is that there needs to be warm water in the ocean, and the warm water heats up the air above it, and this warm air then rises up into the atmosphere. And as the warm air rises, it then cools down and condenses to create clouds. The second thing that needs to happen is that there needs to be a lot of moisture in the air, and this moisture comes from warm ocean water, which evaporates and rises up with the warm air. As the moisture condenses into clouds, it releases that heat, which makes the air around it even warmer and causes it to rise even faster. As the warm, moist air continues to rise, it creates an area of low pressure at the surface, and this draws in more warm, moist air from the surrounding area, which then also rises and creates more low pressure. This cycle is continuous, so more and more warm air, moist air is being drawn in and rising up, and it creates a spiral of wind and clouds. So as the storm continues to spin and grow, it eventually becomes a hurricane. And hurricanes are classified by the strength of their winds, with Category 1 being the weakest and Category 5 being the strongest. The wind speeds for each category are as follows. So for Category 1, you need to have wind speeds between 74 to 95 miles an hour. Category 2 is 96 to 110 miles an hour. Category 3 is from 111 to 129 miles an hour. Category 4, 130 to 156 miles an hour. And Category 5 has wind speeds above 157 miles per hour. So it's important to remember that hurricanes can be very, very dangerous, and it's important to follow the instructions that you're given if you are in an area which is prone to hurricanes. So here's an exam question. Give two conditions necessary for the formation of tropical storms or hurricanes. So for this sort of question, you need to talk about the fact that hurricanes form between 5 to 15 degrees north and south of the equator. That will get you 1 mark. You need to talk about there being warm tropical seas. Better to mention it's 26.5 degrees or higher. And you need to talk about the fact that there is a great amount of evaporation of moisture, which then releases heat, and you have a very, very low pressure in system, which then helps to create the tropical storm. So any 2 points would be sufficient. You wouldn't need to mention all those that I've just talked about, but if there's any others that you can think of that you're more familiar with, then of course they should be fine too. So just like the last couple of sessions that I've run, make sure that you write down this exam question and then attempt it, either using your notes if you're not sure what the answer is, and then attempting it without. Okay, let's move on to the next section, which is going to be on a case study. So, a tropical storm, a lower income country case study. So, today we're going to be looking at Typhoon Haiyan, which is the most common one that's used. There are other ones that you may have studied, such as Cyclone Nargis, for example, and that would be sufficient too. But I'll go through in a lot of detail about Typhoon Haiyan. And it's really important that you learn your case study example. We're going to be looking at another one after this slide. And it's important that you learn the details involved in it. So I've given you a very brief summary of this particular case study on Typhoon Haiyan, but you might want to add some more notes that you already have. So Typhoon Haiyan is or was one of the strongest cyclones that were ever recorded. It hit the Philippines on November the 8th, 2013, with sustained winds of up to 195 miles an hour. So that would be a category 5, and gusts up to 235 miles an hour. The typhoon affected over 14 million people and caused over 6,000 deaths, with another 1,000 people who were missing. The storm brought strong winds, heavy rain, and a storm surge that reached up to 25 feet, which is approximately 7.6 meters in some areas, causing extensive damage to coastal communities. Around 1.1 million homes were damaged or destroyed by the storm, leaving millions of people without shelter. And the scale of the disaster was immense, and it prompted a massive relief effort from the Philippine government and international aid agencies. The response efforts included providing food, water, shelter, and medical care to those in need. Aid workers also worked to restore infrastructure and services, such as electricity and transportation, to help get people back on their feet. The international community pledged over $1.5 billion in aid. The international community pledged over $1.5 billion in aid, reflecting the great scale of the disaster and the urgent need of support. So this case study highlights the vulnerability of coastal areas to natural disasters, especially in developing countries with limited resources to cope with the scale of these events. It also emphasizes the importance of disaster preparedness and response, as well as the need for ongoing efforts to address the potential impact of climate change on tropical cyclones. So overall, Typhoon Haiyan was an extremely tragic event that had a profound effect on the people that were living in the Philippines. It's also a reminder that the importance of supporting communities affected by natural disasters and the need for continued efforts to build resilience and preparedness in the face of such events. The Philippines is located in a particularly vulnerable place, and it is extremely prone to hurricanes during the summer months between June till September. And these hurricanes are frequent. So if you look at a map showing hurricane trajectories over the last 10 years or so, you'll see hundreds of hurricanes that have cut through the Philippines. The Typhoon Haiyan was the worst, but certainly wasn't the only one that affected this island. So it's likely that you'll be asked a 9-mark question on a case study that you did for this topic. From the previous slides, we looked at the science behind how hurricanes form. The likelihood is that you're not going to get longer answer questions for those, but you will get longer answer questions for these case study elements. So I've given you a 9-mark question here. Assess the extent to which tropical storms have effects on people and the environment, and you can use the information. This is taken from an exam paper. Use the information. They might give you a picture, such as this picture here, and an example that you've studied. So for this, you might get 3 additional marks for SPAG. So you need to make sure that your writing, not only in terms of spelling and grammar, is really good, but you need to also make your paragraphs really clear. That plays an element or a role in the SPAG marks themselves. So make sure that you have a 3-part structure to your answer. So there's actually quite a lot that you can say about Typhoon Haiyan, and the key thing here is asking to assess the extent. So what were the different things that affected the people, and how big an impact was that on them? So there's lots and lots of different things that you can talk about. In terms of effects, you can talk about the primary or secondary effects, you can talk about social effects, you can talk about environmental effects, you can talk about economic effects. So, for example, the key things that you could talk about are the number of people that died, or the number of people that were in shock of having their homes completely destroyed, the transportation or communication links that were completely destroyed, the emergency money that was required to help rebuild, the crime or looting that happened after, or even the destruction of livestock or crops, the long-term health effects and insurance claims. You can also talk about effects on the environment, so storm flooding large areas of the coastline, damaging the coastal and river defences. You could talk about coastal habitats being disrupted or destroyed. You could talk about the removal of forests in the area. You could talk about sewage leak or pollution. So all those things would be valid things to mention in your answer. Now, if your aim is to get 7 to 9 marks, then of course you're going to have to validate your points. If you just talk about the fact that, you know, river defences were destroyed or coastal defences were destroyed or there was sewage leaking, those are just general points. So to get, 7 to 9 marks, you need to be writing things such as wind speeds up to 300 kilometers an hour. 6,000 people died, 4 million people were made homeless. Power was, interrupted at Tacloban Airport, for example. The Tacloban city was devastated. I think it was completely wiped out. Um, so, talking about specific things, mentioning specific numbers, um, specific amount that was being pledged to the area would give the examiner the understanding that you really know what you're talking about and help you to get into the top band. Okay, let's move on to the next case study. So now we're going to look at a high income country case study, which is going to be Hurricane Katrina. So Hurricane Katrina happened a few years before the catastrophic hurricane of Typhoon Haiyan. So Hurricane Katrina uh, struck off the Gulf Coast of the United States on 29th of August 2005, and it was a Category 5 hurricane at its peak, and it caused widespread devastation to New Orleans, which is in Louisiana, and to other coastal areas as well. The storm surge and flooding that followed Katrina caused more than 1,800 deaths and about $125 billion in damages, making it one of the deadliest and costliest natural disasters in US history. The flooding also led to the displacement of more than 1 million people, making many of those left without access to basic necessities such as food, water, and medical aid. The disaster also exposed major shortcomings of the US government to the natural disaster response, particularly in terms of the emergency management and its preparedness. It also highlighted the disproportionate impact that such disasters can have on low income and marginalized communities. In the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, a massive recovery effort was put in place to help the affected communities to rebuild and recover, and this included providing emergency aid to those in need, as well as investing in long-term recovery and rebuilding efforts. More than 300,000 homes were damaged or destroyed by the storm, and the recovery effort required a massive investment of resources and expertise. The case of Hurricane Katrina underscores the importance of disaster preparedness and its response, as well as the need for investment in infrastructure and service to reduce the impact of future disasters. It also highlights the importance of addressing social inequalities and the vulnerabilities that can exacerbate the impact of such natural disasters. So Hurricane Katrina was an extremely tragic event that had and it continues to have a lasting impact on people living in New Orleans in particular. And it serves as a reminder that if you are not well prepared, then the consequences of that can be quite devastating. So here's another exam question. Only more developed countries can protect themselves effectively from the damage caused by tropical storms. And so with this question, you can argue yes or no, and you've got the option of essentially choosing a particular case study which supports your argument. So, for example, you might argue yes, and if you do argue yes, developed countries can protect themselves, then the um, you would talk about what measures they put in place to help protect themselves. So in this case, you might want to talk about how in the US they use expensive satellite technology to forecast storm paths. They can afford to set up agencies such as the National Hurricane Center to monitor tropical storms. And then they also give warnings out to residents and holiday resorts if people are obviously out there. They also put into place expensive building design to protect those buildings, particularly those that are near coastal areas. They give people lots of education in school, but also publicly, and they help people to create their own evacuation plans so that in the event that such a thing happens, then they can leave without any long-term consequences of themselves. So the question is really asking you about what management strategies that they've put in place, and uh, it's really important that you learn those key components when it comes to this sort of question. Of course, you can argue completely different way. So, for example, you might want to talk about Typhoon Haiyan, um, and you know, you might want to talk about the fact that they may have used concrete shelters, or they might have built their homes on stilts instead, so that the water, or if there was any storm surges, it would go underneath. Um, Often they have to rely on NGOs because there's a lack of money in the area. And there's generally a lack of education and awareness programs in the area too. Um, and to overcome that, the NGOs might create those programs to help people. And they may even help people to learn how to swim, for example, um, to protect themselves. So there's lots of different ways to approach this particular question. But the key thing here is that as long as you're talking about management techniques and how those help to protect people, that's where you're going to get your marks. And it's really important not to get sidelined with this question and start talking about Hurricane Katrina or just Typhoon Haiyan and all the people that died in the process. Connor, with regards to your question about learning HIC and LIC, I would advise you to learn both. So learn both HIC example and an LIC example. Okay, let's move on to the next section. So this ties in quite nicely with the previous question, exam question that we were looking at. How can we reduce the effects of tropical storms? There's lots of things that anyone can do in these areas. And there's 4 key things that I'm going to go over in just a second. So the 4 key areas that we can use to reduce our impact, reduce the impacts of hurricanes are as follows. So the first one would be to invest in disaster preparedness. So by developing emergency plans, stockpiling supplies, conducting regular drills, exercises, communities can be much better prepared to respond to tropical storms and also reduce the number of casualties and minimize the damage to infrastructure. Second, you can build resilient infrastructure. So by investing in infrastructure that's built to withstand the tropical storms, communities can then reduce the risk of damage and disruption to essential services. And this might help to build. This might help. This might include building seawalls and other protective structures, as well as investing in backup power systems and other critical infrastructure. Thirdly, you can plant trees and maintain green spaces. So trees and green spaces can reduce the impact of tropical storms by absorbing excess water and reducing the risk of flooding. And this can also help to reduce erosion and landslides, which can be a major risk in areas prone to tropical storms. And fourthly, you can educate communities. So providing education and training on how to prepare for and respond to an impact of tropical storms, communities can be much better prepared to deal with these effects. And this might include providing evacuation routes, emergency shelters, and other essential services. Now, these are just 4 key things that I picked out, but of course, you can refer to specific examples further. So by taking these steps and measures, communities can reduce the impact of tropical storms and build greater resilience in the face of these potentially devastating events. And while it might not be possible to prevent tropical storms from occurring altogether, we can work together to minimize the impact and ensure that communities are better prepared to respond when they do happen. So this exam question explained how the effects of natural hazards in urban areas can be reduced using an example that you studied. The natural hazard doesn't necessarily have to be weather hazards. So you could talk about tectonics, for example, or an earthquake example in your answer. Um, but if it's under weather hazards, there's been lots of questions around that. It's absolutely fine for you to talk about damage caused by weather hazards as well. So the key thing to get 3 to 4 marks, you need to have a clear understanding and you develop your ideas with examples, whichever one that you choose to do. So the ones that I've talked about here, you can then put them in context of a particular location, such as New Orleans or uh, the Philippines. Let's move on to the next section. So what are the weather hazards in the UK? The UK is known for its very changeable weather, with a wide range of weather hazards that affect the country. And I'm just going to go through all the main types of weather hazards that the UK faces. So you might want to make a note of these as we go along. So storm and high winds. The UK is often hit by storms and high winds, particularly in the winter months, and this can cause damage to buildings and disrupt transportation and lead to power outages. Flooding is very common. It's a major risk in many parts of the UK, particularly in low-lying areas near rivers, and heavy rainfall can lead to flash flooding and cause significant damage to homes and businesses. Snow and ice. In the winter months, the UK can be affected by snow and ice, which can then make those roads and sidewalks very treacherous and disrupt transportation. And it can also cause damage to buildings and infrastructure. Heat waves. While the UK is not known for its hot climate, heat waves do occur. If you remember July last year, we had up to 42 or 43 degrees Celsius. And this can lead to significant health risks for vulnerable populations, particularly those who are very elderly. Fog is a common weather hazard in the UK, particularly in autumn and winter months, and this can lead to reduced visibility and disrupt transportation. And so the UK government has taken some measures to help protect communities, and this might include investing in flood defences, having regular maintenance of transportation infrastructure, providing emergency services, um, particularly when there are extreme weather events, and raising public awareness of weather hazards and how to help prepare for them. So for this exam question, the weather of the UK is becoming more extreme. Use evidence to support this statement. You'd have to talk about the different types of weather hazards that UK faces. So from droughts to heavy snowfall to hailstorms, thunderstorms, flooding, for example. And then you need to contextualize that with reference to a particular case study. So, for example, you might want to mention the fact that 2022 was an uh, extremely hot summer, the hottest on record. You might want to talk about the fact that 2012 was the wettest summer on record. Um, 2013 and 2014 were also the one of the warmest and sunniest on record. Or you might want to talk about um, flooding that happened in Somerset in 2014 due to extremely heavy rainfall. So any particular example would be fine as long as you give some data to support that viewpoint. Okay, let's move on to the next section. So what are the causes and impacts of floods? And we're going to use a case study here for this particular example. You may have studied something slightly different or completely different, but I'm going to talk about um, January 2014 in Somerset, which was hit by extremely severe flooding, and it affected thousands of people, causing significant damage to people's homes, businesses, and infrastructure. Some 7,000 properties were affected, and there was over £10 million worth of damage done to the area. So the flooding was caused by a combination of different factors, including heavy rainfall, high tides, and a lack of maintenance in the area's river systems. So the River Parrett and the River Tone, which flow through the county, had not been dredged for many years, which meant that they were unable to cope with the increased water levels. This flooding caused significant disruption to local communities, with many people having to be evacuated from their homes. Some people were left without water or access to power for several days, and local businesses were also severely affected, with many forced to close due to flood damage. The cleanup operation involved over 1,000 military personnel who worked alongside emergency services and volunteers to clear up the debris and repair the damage. The response to the flooding involved a range of organisations, including local councils, emergency services, and the military. Evacuation centres were set up to provide support to those who were affected by flooding, and the military was brought into place to provide assistance with the cleanup effort. In the long term, the UK government has committed investing in flood prevention in the area, including dredging of the River Parrett and the Tone and building new flood defences. The local community has also been involved with a recovery effort, with many volunteers working to help those who were affected by the flooding and helping to repair the damage to homes and businesses. The flooding also sparked a national debate about how we manage our river systems in the UK, with calls for increased investment in flood prevention measures of uh, the increased investment in flood prevention measures and also regular maintenance of river channels. So the Somerset floods in January 2014 very uh, you know had huge impact on local communities, but it's a good example of um, what happens if you are not prepared, but also a good example of afterwards making sure that you don't make the same mistakes that were made before. So for this exam question, use examples to describe the impacts of extreme weather hazards, 5 to 6 marks. You just need to talk about a particular case study in a lot of detail and make sure that you refer to facts and figures, but also refer to the fact that how it affected people, businesses, and also what the impacts were on the local councils or even the national government when it came to that particular event. Okay, everyone, so that covers the weather hazards topic for today. Hopefully you got lots out of that, and just remember to go back to this video at the end, rewatch it, pick out those exam questions, and do those exam questions, because if you do them, those are the sorts of questions you're going to get on the actual exam paper. So good practice to write out answers. The more practice that you get done, the better you'll get at writing, particularly over prolonged periods of time in the exam. If you have built up your practice, then you're going to do much better as well. If you're stuck with anything, of course, you can come back and watch these videos. I've got other videos on here with regards to weather hazards questions. Make sure that you watch those as well. And if you have any questions, you can always leave questions after the video in the comments as well. So if you have any particular requests for any topics, then please do let me know in the chat. You can do that now. And tomorrow we're going to do another session, this time on climate change, to wrap up this chunk of revision over the physical geography GCSE. So any questions, let me know. Now's your chance. I've got a question for you guys. Is there anything else that you would like me to cover in particular? It might be content, or it might be questions, or maybe there's something else that's come to your mind. If you can just let me know in the chat, that'd be really helpful. Okay, everyone. So I think that's that for today. Please do like the video, and please do comment on the video as well. I'd really appreciate it. And please do share it with anyone else that you know might be doing GCSE geography, so they can benefit as well. Tomorrow we're going to go over climate change. I'll see you bright and early for that then. Take care.